The first time Henry Bailey saw Mary Sawyer, she was sitting astride a half-wild buckskin stallion that had already thrown two grown men into the dirt, and she was laughing like the animal beneath her was the gentlest creature God ever made. It was the spring of 1886, in the high grass country along Larkspur Creek in Wyoming Territory, and the air still carried the chill of a winter that had not wanted to let go. Henry had ridden out from his own spread, the Bailey Ranch, 6,000 acres of good grazing land that his father had carved out of the territory a generation before, to see about a fence line that kept getting knocked down along the creek that separated his land from the smaller homestead to the west. He had expected to find a hired man mending posts, or perhaps an old widow struggling to keep her cattle contained. He had not expected to find a woman no older than 26, her dark hair pulled back beneath a battered felt hat, riding a stallion that reared and bucked and spun in tight, furious circles while she stayed seated on him as easily as a bird stays seated on a branch in the wind. He reined in his horse at the fence line and simply watched, because there was nothing else a sensible man could do. The stallion bucked hard enough that dust rose in a golden cloud around them, and still she did not fall. She spoke to the animal in a low, steady voice that Henry could not quite make out from that distance, words that seemed to matter less than the calm beneath them, and slowly the horse's temper began to ease. By the time the stallion had settled into an uneasy trot around the corral, Henry realized he had been holding his breath. "You are trespassing on my fence line, Mr. Bailey," the woman called out, not even turning to look at him, though he had said nothing to announce himself. "I did not realize a fence line could belong to a person," Henry said, "seeing as it sits on the boundary between two claims." "It belongs to whoever built it," she said, swinging down from the stallion with the same unhurried grace she had used to stay on him. "And I built it, which makes it mine to worry over and none of your business to fix." She walked toward him, wiping her palms on a pair of canvas trousers that no woman in Larkspur Creek would have been caught wearing to church, and Henry found himself staring longer than was polite. She had a face that was handsome rather than pretty, sun-browned and strong-jawed, with eyes the color of creek water in shadow, gray-green and steady. There was a streak of dirt along one cheekbone that she had not bothered to wipe away. "Mary Sawyer," she said, extending a hand as if she were greeting another rancher instead of a woman being greeted by one. "I run this place since my father passed, 2 winters back." Henry took her hand, surprised by the strength of her grip, the calluses along her palm that spoke of rope and rein and axe handle. "Henry Bailey," he said. "I own the ranch across the creek. I have been having some trouble with my cattle wandering through a break in the fence, and I came to see about mending it." "The break is on your side," Mary said. "Your bull put his head through it trying to get at my mares. I would appreciate it if you kept him closer to home." There was no anger in her voice, only a plain statement of fact, delivered the way a person might tell you that the sky was blue or that winter came after autumn. Henry found himself oddly charmed by it, though he could not have said why. Most of the women he knew in the territory spoke to him with a certain deference, aware that he was one of the wealthier men in the county, aware that a kind word from Henry Bailey might mean the difference between a hard winter and an easy one for a struggling family. Mary Sawyer spoke to him as though his money and his land meant nothing at all beside the simple fact that his bull had broken her fence. "I will see to it personally," Henry said. "And I would be glad to send a man over to help you mend your side if you would allow it." "I would not," Mary said, and there was the faintest curve of amusement at the corner of her mouth, as though she found something funny in his offer. "I have mended worse than a broken rail before, Mr. Bailey. I expect I will manage." She turned back toward the stallion, who was watching her with the wary respect of an animal that had already decided she was not to be trifled with, and Henry understood that the conversation, as far as she was concerned, was finished. He sat on his horse a moment longer, watching her walk away, before he turned his own mount back toward the fence line and the work that had brought him there in the first place. He thought about her for the rest of that day, and for several days after, in a way that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Mary Sawyer had inherited 320 acres from her father, Elias Sawyer, who had come west from Ohio in 1868, with a wife who did not survive the journey and a young daughter who grew up learning to shoot a rifle before she learned to read a Bible. Elias had taught her everything he knew about horses, about the particular language of patience and pressure that turned a wild animal into a willing one, and when he died of a fever in the winter of 1884, he left her the land, the horses, and a debt to the bank in Cheyenne that she had spent 2 years working to pay down. It had not been easy. The town of Larkspur Creek, such as it was, a scattering of buildings around a dry goods store and a church, and a saloon that did more business than either, had never quite known what to make of a woman who ran a horse ranch alone, who rode astride instead of side saddle, who wore trousers when she worked and carried a Colt revolver on her hip when she rode into town. The women whispered that she would never find a husband behaving as she did, and the men, for the most part, either avoided her company or tried to press unwanted help on her, as though her independence were a wound that needed tending rather than a choice she had made with clear eyes. Mary had grown used to it. She had grown used to a great many things, to sleeping alone in the small house her father had built, to breaking horses that other ranchers considered too dangerous to bother with, to riding into Cheyenne herself to sell her stock rather than send a man to do it for her, to the particular loneliness of evenings when the work was done, and there was no one to share the quiet with but the horses in the corral and the wind moving through the grass. She told herself, most nights, that the loneliness was a fair price for the freedom, and most nights she believed it. She had not expected to think about Henry Bailey as often as she found herself doing in the weeks after their first meeting. He came back to the fence line more often than the actual state of the fence required, and Mary was not foolish enough to believe it was because he found fence mending a particularly pleasant way to spend an afternoon. He would ride up to the boundary and find some excuse to speak with her, about the weather, about the price of cattle, about whether she had seen any sign of the wolves that had been troubling ranchers further north. Mary answered him plainly, without encouragement, but she noticed that she began watching for him too some mornings before she caught herself and turned her attention back to the work at hand. It was in early June, when the grass had come up thick and green along the creek, and the first calves of the season were finding their legs, that Henry finally asked her to supper. He asked her the way a man asks a question he has rehearsed too many times, standing very straight beside his horse, his hat in his hands instead of on his head, which struck Mary as either very old-fashioned or very sincere, and possibly both. "I would be glad of your company at my table on Saturday evening," he said. "I have asked my cook to prepare something worth the trip, and I would consider it an honor if you would come." Mary studied him for a long moment. He was a handsome man, she would not pretend otherwise, tall and broad through the shoulders, with a face weathered by sun and work but not yet lined by age, and eyes that seemed to hold a genuine warmth when he looked at her, not the calculating warmth of a man assessing a business opportunity, but something that looked, troublingly, like real feeling. "I will come," she said finally, "on the condition that you understand I am not in the market for a husband, Mr. Bailey. I have a ranch to run, and I intend to keep running it with or without your supper." Henry smiled at that, a slow smile that changed his whole face. "I am not asking you to give up your ranch, Miss Sawyer. I am asking you to eat a meal with me." "Then I accept," Mary said, and found, to her surprise, that she was looking forward to it. The supper at the Bailey Ranch house was, by the standards of the territory, an extravagant affair. Henry's cook, a stout German woman named Greta who had come west with a wagon train some years before, had prepared roast venison and fresh bread, and a pie made from dried apples that Henry had paid dearly to have shipped in from the east. The dining room itself was finer than anything Mary had seen since she left Ohio as a girl, with a long table of polished walnut and a set of china that had belonged to Henry's mother, brought all the way from Missouri in a covered wagon and never once broken, a fact Henry mentioned with evident pride. "You have built something fine here," Mary said, looking around at the room, the heavy curtains, the framed painting of a ship at sea that seemed strangely out of place in a house surrounded by nothing but grass and sky for miles in every direction. "My father built the foundation," Henry said. "I have tried to build on it. I would like to think he would be proud of what it has become." "I am certain he would be," Mary said, and meant it. There was something admirable in what Henry had done, in the steady, patient work of building a ranch that could weather hard winters and dry summers, that could provide comfort and security to the people who worked it. It was not so different in its way from what she had tried to do with her own smaller piece of land, though the scale of it and the comfort it afforded was something she had never had and had told herself for 2 years now that she did not need. "You could have this too," Henry said, and Mary felt the conversation shift beneath her, the way the ground shifts beneath a horse about to bolt. "Have what exactly?" she asked, setting down her fork. "This," Henry said, gesturing at the room, the table, the comfort of it. "A house that does not leak when it rains, a cook who does not let you go hungry when you are too tired to make your own supper, hired men enough that you would never again have to break a wild horse alone, with no one to help you if things went wrong." Mary felt something cool settle in her chest, the beginning of an old, familiar anger. "You are offering me your comfort, Mr. Bailey. I am offering you a life where you would not have to struggle so hard for every small thing," Henry said, and she could see that he believed sincerely that this was a generous thing to offer, that any reasonable woman would be grateful for it. "I have watched you these past weeks. You work harder than any man I employ, and you do it alone, with no one to help you if the work goes wrong. I am not a fool, Miss Sawyer. I can see that you are strong and capable, and that you love that little ranch of yours. But I do not understand why a woman would choose such a hard life, when an easier one is within her reach." Mary sat very still for a moment, feeling the anger settle into something colder and more certain. "Because it is mine," she said. "Every acre of it, every horse in that corral, every board in that fence I mended with my own 2 hands. It is mine, Mr. Bailey, in a way that nothing in this house, fine as it is, would ever be mine if I married into it. I would be a guest in your comfort. I am the mistress of my own hardship, and I will take the hardship, thank you, before I take a comfort that costs me my name and my land and my say in how I spend my days." "I did not mean to suggest you would lose yourself," Henry said, though the flush rising in his face suggested he had not entirely thought through what he was asking. "I only meant that a woman need not suffer to prove her worth." "I am not suffering to prove anything," Mary said, standing now, though she kept her voice level, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of thinking her merely emotional. "I am living the life I chose, on the land my father left me, doing the work I am good at and love. I did not come here tonight looking for rescue, Mr. Bailey. I came because I found your company pleasant, and I hoped you might understand that a woman can want a man's company without wanting his charity." She left shortly after, refusing his offer to have a man drive her home in the buckboard, saddling her own horse in the yard while Henry stood on the porch, hat in hand once more, saying nothing because he could think of nothing to say that would not make things worse. Mary rode home under a sky thick with stars, and told herself she was glad to have made her position clear, and did not examine too closely why the ride home felt so much longer and colder than the ride out had been. Henry did not come to the fence line for nearly 2 weeks after that. He told himself it was because the fence needed no mending, which was true enough, and he told himself it was because he had business in Cheyenne that required his attention, which was also true, though it did not fully explain why he found himself thinking of Mary Sawyer at odd hours, while riding the range or sitting alone at that long walnut table that had suddenly begun to feel too large and too quiet. He spoke of it eventually to his sister Charlotte, who had come to stay with him for a season after her own husband's death left her at loose ends in Missouri, and who had a way of seeing through Henry's careful reasoning that he found both useful and irritating. "You insulted her," Charlotte said, not looking up from the mending in her lap. "You offered her charity when she wanted courtship." "I offered her comfort," Henry said. "I do not see how comfort is an insult." "Because you offered it as a trade," Charlotte said. "Give up your land, give up your work, give up the thing that makes you who you are, and in exchange I will give you a soft bed and a full table." "That is not courtship, Henry. That is a business transaction, and not a very flattering one at that." Henry frowned at his sister, unwilling to admit she might be right, though the truth of it had been sitting uneasily in his chest since the night Mary rode away from his table. "I only wish to see her comfortable." "Comfort is not the same thing as happiness," Charlotte said, "and a woman who has built something with her own hands does not want to be told that her building was a burden she should be relieved of." "If you want that woman, Henry, and I think you do, judging by the way you have moped about this house for 2 weeks, you had better learn to want her as she is, not as you wish to remake her." Henry did not answer, but he thought about his sister's words for a long time that night, and for many nights after, and slowly, though he would not have admitted it easily, he began to understand that Charlotte had seen something true. The trouble that changed everything began, as trouble in that country so often did, with water. The summer of 1886 turned dry early, the creek running lower than any of the old-timers in Larkspur Creek could remember for that time of year, and the ranchers up and down the valley grew uneasy about what a dry summer might mean for the winter grazing to come. It was in the middle of this uneasy summer that Silas Crane, who owned the largest spread in the county after Henry's own, began quietly buying up water rights along the upper creek, and quietly suggesting to anyone who would listen that a woman alone, with no husband and no sons to help her, had no real claim to the water that ran through her land, and might do well to sell out before the dry summer forced the matter. Silas Crane was not a man who did his own dirty work when he could pay someone else to do it, and so it was one of his hired men who rode out to Mary's homestead on a hot afternoon in July and informed her, with a politeness that did nothing to soften the threat beneath it, that Mr. Crane was prepared to offer her a fair price for her land, and that it would be wise to consider the offer, as the coming winter might prove hard for a ranch with no man to see it through. "You tell Mr. Crane," Mary said, standing in her own yard with her rifle resting easily in the crook of her arm, not raised, not threatening, but present, "that I have seen through 3 winters without a man's help, and I expect to see through a good many more. My land is not for sale, and my water is my own, filed and recorded at the land office in Cheyenne with my name on the deed, same as any man's would be. You tell him that." The hired man rode away without further argument, but the trouble did not end there. Within a week, Mary found 2 of her fence posts pulled up and thrown into the creek, and a section of her water gate tampered with in a way that would have flooded her lower pasture had she not caught it in time. She could not prove Crane's men had done it, but she had no doubt in her heart who was responsible, and the knowledge sat in her like a stone. It was Henry who found her repairing the water gate, soaked to the knees in the cold creek water, her jaw set with an anger and exhaustion that she could not quite hide, though she tried. "What happened here?" Henry asked, swinging down from his horse without waiting for an invitation. "Someone tampered with my gate," Mary said. "I expect you can guess who." Henry's face darkened. "Crane." "I have no proof," Mary said, "but I have no doubt either." Henry stood for a moment in silence, watching her work, and then, without asking, he waded into the creek beside her and began helping her lift the heavy gate back into place. Mary opened her mouth to protest, to tell him she needed no help, but something in the set of his jaw, the careful way he waited for her direction rather than simply taking over, made her close her mouth again and simply work alongside him instead. "I am not doing this because I think you cannot," Henry said, as though he had heard the protest she had not spoken. "I am doing it because it is heavy, and because I am here, and because 2 people can lift a gate faster than one, regardless of who those 2 people are." Mary glanced at him, surprised by the careful precision of his words, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. "That is a fair reason," she said. They worked together in silence for a while, the cold water numbing their legs, the afternoon sun beating down on their backs, and when the gate was finally set and secure, they stood side by side in the creek, both of them breathing hard from the effort, and Henry said quietly, "I want to speak with you about Crane. Not because I think you cannot handle him, but because I think two ranches standing together are harder to break than one standing alone. He has been trying to buy up water rights all along this valley, mine included, and I believe he means to control the whole creek before the winter comes." "What are you proposing?" Mary asked, though there was a wariness in her voice, remembering the last time Henry had proposed something to her. "An agreement between us," Henry said. "Not marriage. Not a merger of land. Simply an understanding that if Crane moves against either of us, the other will stand with them. I have more men than you do, and you have a mind for this land that I have come to respect more than I can easily say. I am not offering to rescue you, Mary. I am offering to stand beside you." It was the first time he had called her Mary instead of Miss Sawyer, and she noticed it and found that she did not mind. "I would accept that," she said, "on those terms." They shook hands there in the creek, water swirling cold around their boots, and something passed between them in that handshake that was different from anything that had passed between them before, a kind of respect that neither comfort nor charity could have purchased. The alliance between the two ranches held through the rest of that dry summer, and slowly, Mary found herself trusting Henry in ways she had not expected to. He did not try again to persuade her to give up her land, did not offer again to install her in his comfortable house as though she were a piece of furniture to be arranged to his liking. Instead, he rode the fence line with her, helped her when her help was wanted, and stayed away when it was not. And slowly, without either of them quite naming it, something like love began to grow in the space between them, tended by patience rather than persuasion. He learned, over that summer, the particular music of her laugh, which came rarely but rang out clear and true when it did, usually at some small absurdity, a calf that had gotten its head stuck in a fence, a dog that had taken to chasing its own tail in circles until it fell over dizzy. He learned that she took her coffee black and strong, that she read by lamplight late into the night, worn copies of novels she had carried west from Ohio, that she sang, sometimes, when she thought no one was listening, old hymns her mother had taught her before dying on the trail west so many years before. Mary, for her part, learned that Henry's confidence was not the same thing as arrogance, that beneath the comfortable house and the fine china and the 6,000 acres was a man who worked as hard as any of his hired hands, who rose before dawn to check on a sick calf, who had wept, privately, the night his father died, though he would never have admitted such a thing to anyone but his sister. She learned that his offer of comfort, clumsy as it had come from a place of genuine care, even if he had not yet understood what kind of care she actually wanted. By the time the first frost came in September, they had fallen in love, though neither of them had yet found the courage to say so plainly. It was the barn dance in October, held in the town of Larkspur Creek to celebrate the end of the harvest, that brought matters to something like a crisis. Mary had come alone, as she always did, wearing a green dress that had belonged to her mother, one of the few times anyone in town had seen her out of trousers, and the effect, though Mary herself would not have cared to know it, was striking enough that more than one man in the room found his attention drawn to her throughout the evening. Henry was among them, though he had come with the intention, unspoken even to himself, of asking Mary to dance, and found himself instead watching from across the room as a young rancher named Walter Higgins, newly arrived from Nebraska with a fresh homestead claim and evidently unaware of Mary's reputation for independence, asked her to dance and received a polite but firm refusal. "You would think a woman alone would be glad of the attention," Walter said afterward, loudly enough for half the room to hear, to a group of men gathered near the refreshment table. But Mary Sawyer has always fancied herself above the rest of us, playing at being a man out there on her little ranch. It is unnatural, if you ask me, a woman living alone like that, riding astride, carrying a gun. No wonder she cannot keep a husband. Henry crossed the room before he had fully decided to do so, and found himself standing very close to Walter Higgins, his voice low and dangerous in a way that surprised even him. "You will not speak of Miss Sawyer in that manner again," he said. "Not in my hearing, and not in any hearing that reaches my ears afterward." Walter, sizing up the breadth of Henry's shoulders and the set of his jaw, decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and mumbled something like an apology before retreating to the far side of the room. Henry turned to find Mary watching him, her expression unreadable, and felt a sudden uncertainty about whether he had helped her or, in his own way, undermined her again by fighting her battle for her. "You did not need to do that," Mary said when he came to stand beside her. "I know," Henry said. "I did it anyway because I could not stand to hear him speak of you so, and because it was easier to act than to sit still and listen. I am sorry if it embarrassed you." Mary studied him for a long moment and then, unexpectedly, smiled. "It did not embarrass me," she said. "It surprised me is all. I have spent 2 years defending myself against men like Walter Higgins. I did not expect a man to defend me without expecting something in return." "I expect nothing," Henry said, "except perhaps the honor of a dance, if you would allow it, and no expectation beyond that." Mary considered him for a moment longer and then held out her hand. "One dance, Mr. Bailey, and do not mistake it for anything more than it is." They danced, and it was, in truth, more than either of them was prepared to admit it was. And by the time the music ended, Henry Bailey knew, with a certainty that startled him, that he had fallen in love with Mary Sawyer, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of loving a woman who needed nothing from him but the truth of who he was. The winter that followed would come to be remembered across the territory as one of the hardest in living memory, a season that ranchers would speak of for decades afterward with a kind of hushed dread. The winter that broke fortunes and buried herds and tested every soul in that hard country to its limit. It began, innocuously enough, in November with an early snow that melted within a week, and no one in Larkspur Creek thought much of it, having seen early snows before that came to nothing. But by December, the snows had returned in earnest, and this time they did not melt. The temperature dropped and stayed dropped, colder than anyone could remember, cold enough that a man's breath froze in his beard, and cattle left out on the open range began to die where they stood, unable to break through the crusted snow to reach the grass beneath. Henry, who had always prided himself on his foresight, had brought in as much of his herd as he could manage before the worst of it set in, but even his careful preparation was not enough against a winter of such ferocity. Mary, with her smaller herd of horses, fared somewhat better, having built her stable and shelters with an eye toward exactly this kind of catastrophe, her father having taught her that a rancher who did not prepare for the worst winter of their life would not survive it. But even she found herself working from before dawn until well after dark, breaking ice from the water troughs, forcing hay through drifts that rose higher than her waist, fighting to keep her animals alive through a cold that seemed, some days, determined to kill everything it touched. It was in the deepest part of that winter, in late January, when the temperature dropped to depths that made the older ranchers shake their heads and speak in low voices of winters they remembered from their childhoods in the far north, that Silas Crane made his final move against Mary Sawyer. He came himself this time, rather than sending a hired man, riding out through the snow with 2 of his ranch hands, and found Mary in her barn, exhausted, half frozen, trying to save a foal that had been born too early and was struggling to survive the cold. "I have come to make my final offer," Crane said, standing in the doorway of the barn, snow melting off his heavy coat onto the straw-covered floor. "The bank in Cheyenne holds paper on this land, Miss Sawyer, paper I have recently acquired." Your father's debt was never fully settled, whatever you may believe. I am prepared to forgive that debt entirely and pay you a fair price besides, if you will sign the land over to me before the spring thaw." Mary straightened slowly, her hand still cradling the shivering foal, and looked at Crane with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with weakness. "My father's debt was settled 2 years ago," she said. "I have the paper to prove it, filed at the bank myself." "Papers can be lost," Crane said, and there was something in his voice, some quiet menace, that made clear he was not speaking hypothetically. "Records can be misplaced, especially in a territory as young and disorganized as this one. It would be a shame for a woman alone to find herself without proof of a debt she believed settled, and without the money to fight the bank's claim in court." Mary felt a cold fury rise in her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You are threatening to falsify records against me." "I am simply pointing out," Crane said, "that a woman in your position would be wise to accept a generous offer while one is still on the table. Winters like this one have a way of breaking even the most stubborn spirits, Miss Sawyer. I would not wish to see you broken by it, when a comfortable solution is so readily available." It was at that moment that Henry Bailey arrived, having ridden through the worst of the snow himself, worried, as he had been every day of that terrible winter, about how Mary was faring alone on her smaller spread. He took in the scene in an instant, Crane's men crowding the barn doorway, Mary standing exhausted but unbroken with the foal in her arms, and something in him went cold and still in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "Get off her land, Crane," Henry said, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who owned 6,000 acres and had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "And take your threats with you." "This is a business matter, Bailey," Crane said, though he had gone slightly pale at Henry's sudden appearance. "Nothing that concerns you." "It concerns me a great deal," Henry said, "seeing as I hold my own paper on debts owed to me by half the ranchers in this valley, including, I believe, a rather substantial one owed by you, Crane, from the drought 2 summers back. I have never called that debt in. I would encourage you to consider whether you wish me to reconsider that generosity, in light of your current behavior." Crane's face went through several calculations visible even in the dim light of the barn, and after a long moment, he inclined his head stiffly. "I meant no threat," he said, though his eyes said otherwise. "Merely a business proposition. Then I trust you will not object if I accompany Miss Sawyer to the bank in Cheyenne, once the road's clear, to confirm that her paper is in order," Henry said. "For my own peace of mind, if nothing else." Crane said nothing further, only turned and left with his men, and the barn was silent for a long moment after they had gone, the only sound the labored breathing of the foal in Mary's arms and the wind howling outside the barn door. "You did not need to come," Mary said finally, though there was no anger in it this time, only a kind of weary gratitude that surprised her as much as it did him. "I know," Henry said. "I came anyway because I could not stay away, knowing you were out here alone in this weather, with a man like Crane circling like a wolf around a wounded calf. I did not come to rescue you, Mary. I came because I love you, and I could not bear the thought of you facing that alone." It was the first time either of them had spoken the word love aloud between them, and it seemed to hang in the cold air of the barn like something almost visible, something that neither of them was quite ready to reach for, though both of them wanted to. Mary looked down at the foal in her arms, still shivering, still struggling to draw breath in the cold, and made a decision. "Help me get this foal warm," she said, "and then we will talk." They worked together through the rest of that long night, wrapping the foal in blankets, feeding it warmed milk from a bottle Mary had prepared for exactly this emergency, taking turns holding the small trembling body against their own warmth until, sometime near dawn, the foal's breathing steadied, and its eyes, dark and liquid, opened and fixed on Mary with the particular trust of a creature that has decided, against all odds, to live. It was Mary who spoke first, once the crisis had passed, both of them sitting exhausted in the straw, the foals sleeping between them, wrapped in blankets, warm now and safe. "I heard what you said," she said, "about loving me. I want you to understand something, Henry, before either of us says anything further. I love you too. I have loved you, I think, since that night you helped me lift the water gate and did not once try to take the work from my hands. But I meant what I told you at your table, that first supper. I will not trade my freedom for your comfort. If loving you means becoming a guest in your house, a woman with no land of her own, no work of her own, no say in how I spend my days, then I cannot love you, however much it costs me to say so." Henry was quiet for a long moment, watching the foal breathe steadily in its sleep, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. "I understand that now," he said. "I did not understand it before, not fully. I thought love meant providing, meant giving someone everything I had to give, and I did not think enough about what it would cost you to receive it. I watched you tonight fight for this foal's life with your bare hands, in the worst cold I have seen in my lifetime, and I understood, finally, what my sister has been trying to tell me for months. You do not need me to rescue you, Mary. You have never needed rescuing. What you need, if you will have it, is a partner who stands beside you rather than one who tries to carry you. And if I will have it," Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "then I am asking you to marry me," Henry said. "Not to give up this land, not to give up these horses, not to give up one single thing that makes you who you are. I am asking you to keep your land, your name on the deed, your work, your freedom entire, and to let me build my life alongside yours rather than in place of it. I will not ask you to move into my house unless it is a house we build together, on land that remains yours as much as mine. I will not ask you to stop breaking horses, or riding astride, or carrying that revolver on your hip when you ride into town. I am asking only for the chance to love you as you actually are, not as I once imagined you should be." Mary felt something break open in her chest, something that had been guarded and tight for 2 long years of solitary survival, and she found to her own surprise that there were tears on her face, though she could not have said when they had started. "That is the only kind of marriage I could ever accept," she said, "and it is the only kind I would ever want." They were married in April, once the snow had finally melted and the worst of that terrible winter had passed into memory, though not before it had claimed a heavy toll across the territory. Henry lost nearly a third of his cattle to the cold that winter, and ranchers up and down the valley lost far more. Entire herds wiped out by a season that would come to be called, in the years afterward, the Great Die-Up, a disaster that changed the shape of ranching across the whole of the Wyoming and Montana territories, forcing men who had once let their cattle roam free across the open range to begin fencing and providing shelter in ways they never had before. It was a hard lesson, bought at a terrible price, but Mary's foresight, learned from her father's careful teaching, had spared her small herd nearly entirely, and in the difficult months that followed, it was Mary who taught Henry and his hired men how to build better shelters, how to prepare more thoroughly for winters that could no longer be trusted to spare a careless rancher. The wedding itself was a small affair, held in the little church in Larkspur Creek, with Charlotte standing as Mary's attendant since Mary had no living family to fill the role, and Henry's foreman, a steady man named Jim Watts, standing as Henry's best man. Mary wore her mother's green dress again, the same one she had worn to the barn dance, and Henry wore his father's good suit, kept carefully preserved for exactly such an occasion, and when the Reverend asked if anyone objected to the union, the only sound in the small church was the wind outside, as though even the territory itself had nothing to say against it. But it was the arrangement they made afterward, in the weeks before the wedding, that mattered more than any ceremony, and it was an arrangement unusual enough that it became, for a time, a subject of considerable discussion in Larkspur Creek. Rather than Mary moving into the Bailey Ranch house as a bride absorbed entirely into her husband's household, The two of them built a new house together, on the boundary between their two properties, close enough to the creek that had once been a point of dispute between them that they could hear its water running past their windows at night. Mary kept her deed to her own 320 acres, filed and recorded in her own name at the land office in Cheyenne, exactly as it had always been, and continued to run her horse operation exactly as she always had, breaking and training horses, selling them to ranchers up and down the territory who had by then heard enough of her reputation that they came seeking her skill specifically, rather than merely tolerating a woman doing a man's work. Henry's cattle operation and Mary's horse operation remained, by design, two separate concerns, though they cooperated closely, sharing labor during roundups and branding season, sharing the risk and the reward of ranching in a hard country, but never merging entirely because Mary had insisted, and Henry had come to understand, that the separateness of their work was not a wound in their marriage but one of its foundations. A reminder to them both that love did not require the erasure of either person's self to survive. There were those in town, of course, who continued to mutter that it was an unnatural arrangement, that a proper wife ought to take her husband's name entirely and set aside her own foolish notions of independence. But Mary had grown accustomed to such mutterings over the years, and found that with Henry standing beside her, unbothered by the gossip and openly, publicly proud of his wife's skill and her success, the mutterings troubled her far less than they once might have. "Let them talk," Henry said once, when a particularly disapproving matron in town had made pointed remarks about Mary's trousers and her rifle and her insistence on riding to Cheyenne alone to conduct her own business dealings. "They will still be talking long after we have both grown old and gray, and we will still be exactly as happy as we are now, regardless of what they say." Mary had laughed at that, the clear, rare laugh that Henry had come to treasure above almost anything else in his life, and had leaned into his shoulder as they rode home together in the long gold light of a summer evening, and had thought, not for the first time, that she had been right to hold out for exactly this kind of love, the kind that did not ask her to become smaller in order to fit inside it. Their life together in the years that followed was not without its hardships, for ranching in that country never was, but it was a life built on a foundation strong enough to weather them. They faced another hard winter in 1888, though nothing to match the severity of the great die-up, and they weathered it together, Mary's careful preparations and Henry's steady resources combining to see both their herds through safely. They faced, too, occasional trouble from Selah's crane, who continued for some years to make trouble in the valley, buying up water rights and pressuring smaller ranchers to sell, until a bad investment in Cheyenne finally broke his fortune and forced him to sell off most of his own land, much of it, in an irony that gave both Mary and Henry considerable satisfaction, purchased at fair price by the two of them together. The water rights that Crane had once hoarded distributed once more among the smaller ranchers of the valley who had need of them. In the autumn of 1887, a little more than a year after their wedding, Mary gave birth to their first child, a son they named Elias, after her father, a boy who from his earliest years showed an unmistakable love of horses that delighted Mary beyond measure and amused Henry, who liked to joke that the boy had clearly inherited his mother's stubbornness, along with her way with animals, seeing as young Elias insisted on trying to ride before he had properly learned to walk. 2 years after that came a daughter, whom they named Charlotte, after Henry's sister, who had by then remarried a rancher 2 counties over but remained close with Mary and Henry both, visiting often enough that young Charlotte grew up knowing her aunt and namesake nearly as well as she knew her own parents. Mary continued breaking and training horses throughout both pregnancies and after, adjusting her work as needed but never once considering giving it up entirely, and Henry, true to the promise he had made in that cold barn so many years before, never once asked her to. He built her a proper training corral near the new house, wider and better constructed than her old one had been. And when their children grew old enough, both Elias and Charlotte spent as many hours in that corral learning their mother's craft as they did learning their father's, so that by the time they were grown, both children could break a horse or manage a cattle drive with equal skill, having inherited the best of what both their parents had to offer. Mary Sawyer Bailey, as she came to be known in the valley, though she was always careful to remind people that Sawyer remained her name as much as Bailey did, became, in time, one of the most respected horse breeders in the territory, her reputation extending well beyond Larkspur Creek to ranches across Wyoming and even into Montana, where ranchers would send word asking if she might spare the time to break a particularly difficult animal that no one else could manage. She never stopped riding astride, never stopped carrying her revolver when she rode alone, never stopped wearing trousers to work, no matter how many years passed and how much the town's opinion of her softened as her success became too obvious to dismiss. Henry, for his part, grew into the kind of husband that other men in the valley, watching from the outside, could not quite understand and privately envied. A man who spoke of his wife's work with open pride rather than the quiet embarrassment some might have expected, who never once tried to diminish her accomplishments to preserve his own sense of authority, who understood, by the time their children were grown, that the love he had found with Mary Sawyer was worth infinitely more than the comfortable, conventional marriage he might once have imagined for himself, precisely because it had never asked either of them to become less than they were. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in the spring of 1896, Henry and Mary rode out together to the same fence line where they had first met, the boundary between what had once been two separate properties and had long since become, in practice if not in name, a single shared life. The fence itself had been rebuilt many times over the years, but the creek ran the same as it always had, and the grass came up green in the spring the same as it always had, and Henry, looking at his wife in the fading light, thought that she was more beautiful to him now, weathered by years of sun and work and motherhood, than she had been that first day he saw her holding her seat on a bucking stallion, though the fierce, unbroken spirit that had drawn him to her then remained entirely undimmed. "Do you remember," Henry said, "what you told me that first supper at my table?" "That I would not trade my freedom for your comfort," Mary said, smiling at the memory. "I remember it well." "I meant every word of it." "I know you did," Henry said. "It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand what you meant. I thought, for a long while, that love was a thing a man provided, a comfort he offered in exchange for devotion. I did not understand until that winter, until I watched you fight for that foal's life with your bare hands in the worst cold either of us had ever seen, that love is not a trade at all. It is a choosing, over and over, to stand beside someone exactly as they are." Mary reached over and took his hand, their fingers interlacing easily, comfortably after 10 years of practice. "You understood in time," she said. "That is what matters." Not every man would have. Most, I think, would have gone on trying to remake me into something more comfortable to love, and I would have had to leave, and both of us would have spent our lives poorer for it. "I am glad every day that I understood in time," Henry said, and leaned over in his saddle to kiss her, there at the fence line where it had all begun, the creek running cold and clear beside them, their children waiting at home with Greta's supper on the table, their two ranches thriving side by side, separate and whole and entirely, unmistakably theirs. They rode home together as the sun went down over the Wyoming grass, two people who had built a life together not by becoming one thing, but by remaining, faithfully and completely, two, bound not by comfort or convention but by a love that had learned, slowly and honestly, to want nothing more than the other's freedom, and to call that wanting at last by its truest name. In the years that followed, Mary Sawyer's horse ranch grew into one of the most respected operations in the territory, and when Wyoming finally achieved statehood in 1890, granting women in the new state the right to vote, A right Wyoming would be the first in the nation to extend. Mary rode into Larkspur Creek herself to cast her vote, with Henry standing proudly beside her, and their children watching, old enough by then to understand that their mother had helped in her own quiet way. To prove that a woman's independence and a woman's love were never, in truth, in conflict at all, but two halves of the very same brave and honest heart.